Today, I want to talk about why World War II is the single most defining event in Russian history. For countries around the world, shared collective suffering is often the cornerstone for what makes a people define itself. For the Israelis, it is the Holocaust. For the Armenians, the Armenian genocide. For the Mongolians, it is the conquest of Genghis Khan. But for the Russians, who are divided on a number of issues stemming from economics to international politics to culture, the one defining cultural memory that almost every family shares is the suffering that World War II begot the Russian people. Today, I'm going to talk about the event that isn't referred to as World War II in that country so much as it is referred to as the Great Patriotic War, or Великая Отечественная война. Let's begin. It is often said that World War II was won with American steel, British intelligence, and Russian blood. Nowhere is that more evident than in Stalingrad. Let's talk about it. It's a battle over the southern Russian Caucasus oil fields. And it started out with simply being a small skirmish. The Germans said that at the time, Stalingrad was no more than a name on a map to us. It quickly turned into a cauldron battle, because for the Russians, not only was it a strategic point on the Volga River that controlled the logistics and the benefits received from us Americans through the Lend-Lease Act, it was also symbolic because it bore the name of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. For the Germans, it was equally important because of the Caucasus oil fields, but also because it held most of the Russian forces on the southern front of the war. To put it into perspective, more Soviets died in the Battle of Stalingrad alone than nearly every single US military death in our entire history. So what that means is, think of every Iwo Jima, think of every D-Day, think every Battle of the Bulge or battles of Gettysburg. If you add all of them together, they don't compare to how many people died on the shores of the Volga and Stalingrad. Now what that means is, Stalingrad today is synonymous with suffering and victory in the same way that the word Einstein may be synonymous today with genius. Some interesting parts of the battle. The house of Pavlov, Dom Pavlova, is said to have been a home defended on the Russian side of Stalingrad. And it is said that more Germans died trying to take this one home than died trying to take over all over France. In the northern side, there was the tractor factory, where legends say that tractors were being made in the tractor factory and driven straight off the assembly line, straight into battle. In the southern half, there's the Mamayev Kurgan, an old barrow right that turned into a flashpoint of the battle, where either side, at multiple points during the battle, took it, captured it, defended it, lost it, and did it over and over and over again. The battle also gave birth to some iconic phrases, one being Order 229, Stalin's famous decree saying not one step back, ni shagu nazad. That is part of a larger and longer directive to talk about how the Soviet Union was losing badly at the time. And he said, we keep thinking that we have endless amounts of land and endless amounts of people to concede to the enemy. However, there is a limit to how much we can retreat. If we don't hold Stalingrad, then the Nazi forces will soon take over the rest of the country. And while we even hold Stalingrad, the enemy controls most of our western country, and the people curse the Red Army for abandoning them in their time of need. So it gave birth to the phrase, for us, there's no land beyond the Volga.
Ну что я могу сказать? В Берлине, в центре. Говорю, так забудешь. Не вдумайся глубоко, посмотришь. Напротив Рейхстаг. А здесь Бранденбургские ворота, которые ебельство камнем, который заложил. Все равно прошли.
The Soviets would go on to drive the Nazi Germans back to Berlin, capturing it in a final climactic battle in which they were able to raise their flag over the Reichstag. That cultural memory is immortalized in various reenactments, songs, and poems from that era. It is extremely important today, and you can even find the phrase "to Berlin" written on tanks and helicopters in the Ukrainian-Russian war today, symbolizing just how far the cultural memory goes. Now, the after effects of the war can be still felt today. Russia still feels vulnerable because ultimately it is and always has been a prisoner of geography. The Russian heartland lies on the middle of the Eastern European steppe. Essentially, there is no natural barriers between the heartland of Russia and Europe. What that means is throughout history, Russia has faced several invasions from the West, from Napoleon to Hitler. And their entire geopolitical strategy relies on conquering as many lands as possible westward so that they can build a buffer in case of any future invasions. Furthermore, Russia does not have any warm water ports. It has a few ports along the ocean. However, they are frozen throughout much of the year, meaning that they don't have any access during the winter months. For their warm water ports in the Black Sea and even on the Mediterranean are heavily disadvantaged in that they must pass through the Straits of Istanbul, meaning that any time of war, Turkey can close off Russia's access to beyond the Black Sea by simply closing its gates. That means that Russian strategy has always been outward expansion.
Молодой чех, которому всего 25 лет, он помнит 68-й год, но он не помнит 9 мая 45-го года, когда война была закончена, а мы все равно послали наши танки в истекающую кровью Прагу. И вы все здесь сидите, вы бы сейчас сидели в Бухенвальде, в немецком концлагере, если бы не наша армия, которая 50 лет назад освободила.
So that brings us into today. World War II still affects Russia precisely because from the Russian perspective, history is a never-ending cycle of invasions from the West, whether it's Napoleon or Hitler, which brings us to a catch-22 situation today, where a lot of countries want to join NATO because they fear invasions from Russia. However, Russia fears NATO encircling it, therefore wants to invade countries to stop them from joining NATO. Now, this can be summed up by simply saying a country that it is obsessed with not being surrounded fears it is being surrounded. So what does that mean? It means that while Putin is currently the Ukrainian war's chief architect, the roots that drive Russia into invading Ukraine may run much deeper than one man alone. If you take a look at Russian politics today, there are many other figures who support the war and do so even more than Putin. Alexander Dugin, the author of Foundations of Geopolitics, often wrote about Russia's destiny in order to conquer lands to the east and west in order to protect it from future invasions. Zhirinovsky, the former leader of LDPR, often talk about wanting to see Russian soldiers wash their boots on the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. And then finally, taking a look at Prigozhin, who ran a short-lived revolution up against the Russian president himself with his Wagner mercenary group, it is important to remember that he wasn't necessarily against the war when he revolted against Putin. He was against how badly it was run. I think these examples show that even if tomorrow Putin was no longer in the picture, the war might still be, because the reason that Russia has gone into this war will still be present. So the irony of the stated goals that Putin outlined in the beginning of the war is that every single goal seemingly has backfired. Russia wanted to stop the expansion of NATO. Because of the war, I believe two further countries, Sweden and Finland, have joined NATO. So it has actually expanded the border that Russia shares with NATO. Secondly, it sought to weaken Ukrainian identity by arguing that the Ukrainians were simply a part of Russia. There is nothing that has unified Ukrainian identity more than this war. And then finally, it wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. However, in the words of Prigozhin himself, Ukraine is now militarized more than ever. When it might have 500 tanks, it now has 5,000. When it might have had 500,000 soldiers mobilized, now it has the entire country mobilized. But that creates a problem in and of itself. So this is a problem for the future because it doesn't assuage Russian fears, it actually intensifies it, in an effect that IR scholars call the security dilemma. Russia fears a militarized Ukraine, so it invades. Ukraine is now very militarized, and now the Russians, from their perspective, have more of a reason to fear what might happen in the future just because of how militarized NATO and Ukraine is now currently. Now, what that means is Russia will continue this war as long as it feels as though the threat to the country is bigger than any consequences for continuing this war.